of hell cannot prevail against her. This is the faith which has the keys of the kingdom of heaven." End quote. Indeed, as one reads all of chapter 37, one finds Hilary referring to each of the prime texts upon which the papacy is built, including John 21 and Luke 22, and yet not once mentioning the papacy. Can you imagine a modern Roman apologist citing all three of these passages and not mentioning the papacy at all? From whence cometh this perverse notion that the passage here refers to the faith of Peter's confession and not to Peter himself? Was it not the common belief of Christians for centuries before that this passage referred to Peter, thus establishing the papacy? How could Hilary be ignorant of such a basic truth? And how could he be joined by the likes of John Chrysostom or Gregory Nazianzus? How could these great men and preachers be ignorant of such a basic truth? Unless perhaps it was not a basic truth at all? And what of the great Augustine? Surely many are aware of his statements in his Retractationis regarding this passage and its meaning, and I shall not take the time to read it to you yet once again. I would point out, however, that Augustine left his readers to decide how they would interpret the passage. May I ask us all to think seriously about what it means that the great Bishop of Hippo, Augustine, could think that how one views this passage is a matter of freedom, when Vatican I tells us it is a matter upon which the anathema can and should be used? Can we not see in this the tremendously huge amount of evolution that has taken place between the early part of the 5th century and the latter part of the 19th? Indeed we can. In fact, I might note in passing that Dr. Froelich said, quote, "The most astonishing fact is that in the entire Middle Ages, in contrast with the polemical literature of the period, specifically exegetical literature universally made the equation rock Christ, not rock Peter." End quote. I'm inclined to agree with William Cathcart, who wrote with reference to the patristic interpretation of the rock as Christ, quote, "The same view of this scripture was taken by other leading fathers of the church, and outside of Rome, for the first 5 centuries of our era, no Christian father of any note dreamt that this saying gave Peter the sovereignty of the church." End quote. And I will finish my time reading from Jackson, who said in regards to the time of Basel, quote, "In truth, the supremacy of the Roman See, as it has been understood in later times, was hardly on the horizon at this time. No bishop of Rome had even been present in Nicaea or at Sardica, where a certain right of appeal to his see was conceded. A bishop of Rome signed the Sirmian blasphemy. No bishop of Rome was present to save the world from the lapse of Ariminum. The great intellectual Arian war was fought out without any claim of Rome to speak. Half a century after Basil's death, great Orientals were quite unconscious of this supremacy," referring there to Theodoret. End quote. Who has presented the early church evidence this evening? Who has been quoting the early fathers? I will continue to do so in the time that is allotted to me after this. Thank you very much.
You have 12 minutes in your rebuttal.
Let's look at some of this material that Mr. White has been drawing our attention to. I think some important aspects of it have been left out, perhaps not intentionally. If you turn to the back index of a 3-volume work, which is much larger than the book I mentioned before by Giles, although admittedly the drawback for those of you who are perhaps overly concerned about bias is that it's edited by a Catholic scholar. You have a 3-volume work called The Faith of the Early Fathers. It too is just simply an anthology of primary source documents. In the back of it there's a scripture index, a topical index, there is a propositional index. And if you turn to that propositional index, an index of propositions taught by the Church Fathers, you find the following propositions made under the subheading, the primacy of the Pope. And these statements are made. Proposition 430, in other words, all the statements that the Church Fathers teach are all numbered and listed out for you. Among the apostles, Peter received from Christ the primacy of the jurisdiction over the church. That is, he is the first governor over the church. He has a headship over the church. And there are 20 quotes from the Church Fathers that substantiate this particular proposition from the early Church Fathers. The second proposition is this one, 21, excuse me. The second one is 431. Peter came to Rome and died there. 17 Church Fathers attest that. Thirdly, Peter established his episcopal see at Rome and made the Bishop of Rome his successor in the primacy. 17 Church Fathers attest to that. The Roman pontiffs have always laid claim to the primacy of jurisdiction. 20 church fathers speak to that. From earliest times, the Roman Church has been regarded by the Church as the center of its unity. 11 church fathers speak to that. And from earliest times, lastly, it was acknowledged that supreme power over the whole Church belonged to the Bishop of Rome as successor of Peter. 27 church fathers defend that. Now, that's a lot of statements, and I don't have the time to read them all tonight. I would love to take you through each and every one of these. But as I say, I'll simply focus on, just for the sake of intellectual honesty and to maintain credibility with you, I will simply focus on the ones that Mr. White himself has brought up as arguing against the Catholic position. So let's look, first of all, at these successor lists that he alludes to in Kelly's dictionary on the popes. Actually, I won't take any time with that. Let me move on to Clement, because I think that is something Mr. White leaned upon more heavily. But I should simply note in passing that the reason in some of these earlier lists that Anacletus is the first in the list and not Peter is because if you look at the whole list, ladies and gentlemen, I would encourage you to look them up in Jurgens, as I was doing. These lists are lists of successors to Peter. That is why Peter's name does not appear there first. The later lists give the list of the Bishop of Rome. I'm going to read you the most famous of those in Irenaeus, and Peter is there listed first. Let me move on, secondly, then, to Clement's letter to the church at Corinth. As Mr. White points out, the date is in dispute. The general consensus is that it was written in 96 A.D., while Clement was Bishop of Rome. But Father Jurgens argues that it might have been written in A.D. 80. Many scholars, an increasing number in fact, are arguing that it was written prior to A.D. 70. Because in the letter of Clement, he compares the worship of Christians to the worship that the Jews are still performing in the temple, and speaks in the present tense as though it's still going on. The sacrifices are still being offered there. The Levites and the priests are engaging in this worship in a still standing temple. The date, therefore, is perhaps important. But regardless of when you date the letter undeniably comes across with a strong emphasis of authority. Let me read to you a couple of quotes from this letter, something that I don't believe Mr. White did, and I want him to correct me if I'm wrong on that. I don't want to accuse him of anything. He's a very articulate speaker, and he's saying so many things I don't always not always keeping up with him. But here's what Clement says to the church at Corinth. He says, because they're having this problem of deposing the elders, he says this in chapter 59. If any disobey the words spoken by the Lord through us, let them know that they will